Hi everyone, we're continuing our series of beginner chess videos here on My Chess Notebook. And today's topic is pins. So you pin a piece when you attack it and there's a more valuable piece behind it. For instance, in this position, if white moves his bishop to the c4 square, then he has just pinned the rook. Pinning it means fixing it in place so that it can't be moved. And the reason that rook cannot be moved is because there's a king behind it. So if the rook moved, black would be in check. So it's illegal to move. So the best black can do here is move his king, and then white would happily take that rook, and the game would be drawn. Let's look at another pin. So here it's white to move, and if he moves his bishop to the g3 square, then he has just pinned this knight because there's a more valuable piece behind it, which in this case is a rook. However, there's a difference between this pin and the one we were just looking at. In this case, this rook is said to be in an absolute pin because it cannot move. It absolutely cannot move. So an absolute pin is when the more valuable piece behind it is a king. But in this position, this knight is not in an absolute pin because it is legal to move it. We call such a pin a relative pin. So a relative pin does not have a king behind it, but has some other piece behind it. So what's the difference? Well, normally you don't want to move a piece that's in a relative pin either, even though you're legally able to. For example, if black moves his knight here, then white would just happily take the 5-point rook for his 3-point bishop. But there may be reasons to move a piece that is in a relative pin. In this case, black can move it to d3 and attack white's rook, so that if white does take black's rook, then black can get the rook in return, and it's an equal trade. And by the way, I'll mention something else really interesting about this position. Once white pinned the knight, black has another option that's very sneaky. He can move his king to the b7 square, which releases the rook to move sideways here. And here's the point. If white takes the undefended knight, then the rook can come in and pin the bishop. And that bishop is in an absolute pin. It absolutely cannot move. And there's no way to defend it. So once white makes a move, any move at all, black will recover his lost piece, and the game's about equal. All right, let's take a look at an opening where pin occurs. So let's say the opening begins where the players push their pawns in front of their kings, and then white brings a knight out and attacks black's pawn in the center, and black defends the pawn with a knight move. And let's say white plays bishop to b5. So that attacks the knight, but the knight's not in any danger here because it's well defended. It's defended by a couple of pawns. However, suppose black pushes his d-pawn forward to d6. Well, he's just voluntarily placed his knight in an absolute pin, since now there is a king directly behind the knight, and the knight can't move. Let's say white continues by pushing a pawn in the center of the board like this, and black makes a horrible move, pawn to a5. Why is that move so horrible? Well, it's because white can push his d-pawn forward and attack that pinned knight. And since the knight is in an absolute pin, it just can't save itself. Black needs to make some move here, and then white happily takes the knight for his pawn. So why was a5 so horrible? Well, it allowed that pawn to come forward and attack that pinned piece. So other possible moves here could have been pawn takes pawn, so that couldn't happen. Or another idea is to play the pawn forward only one square to attack the bishop. So if this pawn does come forward to attack the knight, well, black can take the bishop and white can take the knight, and it's an even trade. Let's take a look at another opening. Okay, here the players will push the pawns in front of their queens. Now, white will play the move pawn to c4, black plays pawn to e6, white brings a knight out, black brings a knight out, and now white pins that knight. What kind of a pin is this? That's right. This is a relative pin. It's not an absolute pin because there's not a king behind it. So that means the knight can move if black chooses. He probably doesn't want to move it, however, because if he does, he's going to lose his queen. Okay, so let's say the game continues by black moving another knight into the game, and then white initiates a pawn trade. And now white looks at the position and says, hey, that knight right there is in a relative pin. It doesn't want to move because I'll get the queen behind it. So that knight's not really defending that pawn, so why don't I just take it? Okay, well, this illustrates that relative pins really are different than absolute pins because black shocks white by taking the knight anyway. Now white's kind of stroking his head saying, wait a minute, you can't do that, I'm just going to take the queen. Okay, but then black says, no, wait a minute, I'm going to call check here, and there's only one way to get out of check, which is to block with your queen, and then I'm going to win the queen back. And call check, and white will take the bishop, and black will take the bishop. And you'll notice black has 3 minor pieces, and white only has 2. So black has more material in the position. So relative pins mean you normally don't want to move the piece because there's a more valuable piece behind it, but there may be a very compelling reason to do so, and that was a very tricky position. Let's look at one more opening. Okay, now here, let's say white moves his bishop and puts that knight in a relative pin like in the last opening. Now, white is threatening something. If it were white's move again, he'd be threatening to push this pawn forward and attack that knight like we saw earlier. Well, let's say black ignores that and plays his bishop out and puts white's knight in an absolute pin. Is that safe to do? Can black play like this? Well, it turns out yes, it's safe because if white pushes his pawn to attack the pinned knight, yes, it's true, black doesn't want to move that knight, but black can counterattack, attack the bishop that's doing the pinning, so that if white takes the knight, black can take the bishop for an even trade. Or if the bishop falls back here to safety and retains the pin, then black can push his g-pawn forward 2 squares and break the pin. We call that breaking the pin when you block it out. So now if white moves the bishop to safety, this knight is no longer pinned and it can move. And a really great square to move it to is e4, which attacks white's piece that's in an absolute pin. And if white doesn't move the bishop to safety and takes the knight instead, well, then black takes the bishop for an even trade. Okay, so that's a typical way to get out of a pin is to move these pawns. 1 pawn, 2 pawns, and block it out like that. So that's one way to get out of a pin. Okay, let's have a look at this position. Now it's white to move, and white is already pinning a couple of pieces. This queen is placing the bishop in an absolute pin, and this bishop is placing the rook in an absolute pin. One thing white could do here would be to take that more valuable rook for his bishop, but it's not such a good idea. For one thing, black is still up a little bit of material. Notice how many pawns he has. But for another thing, there was a much better move in the position. Even though there are already 2 pins in the position, white's best move is to initiate a 3rd pin, rook to g1, pinning the queen to the king. That is an absolute pin, so white is going to win the queen. Either black takes the rook and wins something for his queen, or he leaves the queen there and white will take it anyway. And again, white is willing to trade his rook for a queen. That's a much better trade for white. Take a look at this position. So here, white can again pin the black queen to his king by playing bishop to c4. And that's an absolute pin, and there's nothing black can do about it. Notice if black takes the bishop, well, the bishop was defended by the knight, so white comes out ahead. In this position, the white pieces are going to coordinate to attack black in a hurry. And white begins by pushing this pawn forward and calling check. Now let's look at the possible responses black can take. Can he take the pawn? No, it's defended by the rook. Can he come here or here? No, those are both defended by the rook. Can he go there? If you look at the whole board, you'll notice there's a bishop down here defending that square. So there's only two legal moves, either king to f8 or the king could have gone to the e8 square. But either square black goes to, the bishop and the rook coordinate here, and white makes an excellent move. Do you see it? Yeah, white moves the rook up to the h8 square and pins the black queen to the king, like we saw in the last couple of positions. And there's nothing black can do about it. He can get a rook for his troubles, but white is going to go ahead in the game. So white has more material. Let's look at another position. Okay, notice here the rook is pinning the knight. The knight is in an absolute pin, but white doesn't want to take that knight because a rook is more valuable and that trade benefits black. But here's another idea. When you pin one of your opponent's pieces, try to bring some more pieces into the attack. Try to attack the pinned piece. There's a phrase we sometimes use called pin it and win it. So you pin the piece and then you win the piece. You can win the piece here by attacking it further. First, the bishop attacks it. Okay, but this knight can defend again. But then this rook attacks it again. Okay, and now black cannot defend that knight anymore. He just needs to make some move here, and whatever move he makes, white takes the knight. Because if black recaptures the bishop, then white takes the other knight with check, and the king has to move aside, and white is up a whole rook here. Black has an extra pawn, but white has a lot more material. Okay, let's look at this position. So here, notice the queen is right in line with the black king. What that means is this pawn is in an absolute pin. It can't do what it normally does. That pawn is normally defending these two squares. And what I mean by that is if white places a piece on one of these squares, that pawn could normally capture it, but not if it's pinned. So white's best move here is to take advantage of that and play knight takes this pawn, and that is a royal fork. And the knight cannot be captured. It's an illegal move. That's in an absolute pin. So all black can do is move the king, and then you take the queen. Okay, let's look at another similar position. So here, notice this rook is lined up with that rook. That means this pawn cannot do its normal defensive duties and defend these squares. So white takes advantage of that and plays knight here, and that is a fork, checking the king and attacking the bishop. And if black takes the knight, which is not a good idea, then he loses the rook. Or maybe it is a good idea because if he doesn't take the knight and he just moves the king somewhere, then black loses the bishop. Okay, so you decide which is the lesser evil. Okay, let's look at another position. Okay, it's black to move here. Now be very careful. This looks like a free knight, but black should not take it. Do you see why? Yeah, notice these two rooks are menacingly lined up down this file. White would win immediately with rook here, checkmate. The rook is defended by the other rook, and there's no way out of the check. So that is not a free knight. However, notice this rook is in line with the king here, which means, again, this pawn is in an absolute pin and cannot do its normal defensive duties. And black takes advantage of that by playing his knight here, calling check. The knight cannot be captured, so that's a fork. White just needs to move the king somewhere, and then black takes the rook. And white recaptures the knight, but that trade benefits black. And now black can even go further and take this knight. So black is up a whole rook here for a pawn. Okay, let's look at another position. All right, so this is a similar idea of a pawn being in an absolute pin. So notice this queen is lined up with that black king, which means that pawn can't move. It can't move forward. It cannot capture. So it is not doing its normal defensive duty on this square. So you can probably guess white's move here. That's right. The knight goes to that square, and that's a nice royal fork, forking the king and the queen. The pawn just cannot take it. That's illegal. There's a queen here. So black needs to move the king somewhere, and then white wins the queen. Okay, let's take a look at another position. So here, white has a couple of major pieces lined up on this file against black's queen, which means this pawn might be in a pin here. It doesn't have its normal defensive capabilities, but not really. Okay, so is this a pin? Is this knight defending this queen or not? Well, let's just take that knight. Okay, black doesn't want to recapture with the pawn and lose the queen since the knight is no longer defending it. So what does black do? Well, maybe he takes the rook with his rook. But then white takes the rook, again counting on the fact that that pawn is in a relative pin. So if you look at the piece count on the board, each side has a queen and a rook right now, but white has an extra knight. So white's winning, and if black takes white's queen, that's just a trade of queens. We get the queen back there. So it's all based on that pawn being in a relative pin. And let's look at another position. Okay, this one's really tricky, but if you look at this rook down here on the D1 square, it's lined up with the black king, but there's a couple of things in between here, the knight and the pawn. Nevertheless, the best move here for white is a move you might not consider at first. Knight takes that pawn. That's not a move that springs to most people's minds because that pawn looks like it's defended by that other pawn. But if this knight takes the pawn, that releases this rook, and that pins this pawn. That pawn is in an absolute pin, so it cannot take the knight. Okay, so that's a fork, checking the king and attacking the bishop. And the king is defending the bishop, but it's in check, so it has to move out of the way, and it cannot stay in contact with that bishop, and then white will win it. So very tricky. And we'll look at one last position, also a very tricky position. So here it is black to move. So this is a defensive idea. This pawn looks like it can capture the bishop, but black doesn't want to do that because that pawn was in a relative pin. He'll lose his queen. So what does black do about this? Well, he breaks the pin with a forcing move. He moves the queen out of the way and then takes the bishop. But wait a minute, can he move the queen anywhere he wants and then take the bishop? No, because he doesn't get two moves in a row. White will just move the bishop to safety. But he can move the queen out of the way and call check. So once white gets out of check, then black can take the bishop. And there are a lot of ways to get out of check here. You can move the king, you can block the check, but any way you do it, you're going to get that bishop. And so now white has more, or black rather, has more material. Okay, so we saw a lot of pins in this lesson. Keep your eye out for them in your own game. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you for the next video.